morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Naga Manchetti and Ben Thompson.
Our headlines today. It's time to get serious about climate change. Boris Johnson will tell a summit of world leaders that urgent action is needed to save the planet.
Just days after the conviction in the George Floyd murder trial, the funeral is taking place of a 20-year-old black man, Daunte Wright, shot dead by a police officer in the same city.
4,000 fans and no social distancing. The Brit Awards is to be the first major indoor music event to see the return of audiences since the start of the pandemic.
Good morning. As the fallout from the plans for a European Super League continues, Tottenham supporters protest against their owners outside their ground before watching their team win under the new interim head coach at Spurs.
Marcus Rashford turns MasterChef. We catch up with the footballer after he teamed up with celebrity chef Tom Kerridge to create cheap, healthy family meals.
If I could literally go back as a kid, this is the thing that I'd learned to do, as well as do what I was doing with my football and stuff. When I went home, I would have loved to have been able to sit down and just learn to cook.
Good morning. It's a cold and a frosty start to the day today, but for many of us, there'll be lengthy sunny spells. A bit more cloud across the far north of Scotland could produce the odd shower, and it's also going to be fairly breezy around the English Channel. But I'll have all the details in about 10 minutes.
Good morning. It's Thursday, April 22nd. Our top story is that Boris Johnson will today urge world leaders to preserve our planet for generations to come.
He will tell a virtual summit hosted by US President Joe Biden that 2021 must be the year countries get serious about stopping climate change. Our chief environment correspondent Justin Rolat reports.
John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, has been elbow bumping his way around the world in the past few weeks as part of the US's effort to raise global ambition on the climate issue.
We'll work together to address the climate crisis.
This week, the UK announced it planned to make even more aggressive emissions cuts. And to kickstart the talks, we're anticipating the US president will do the same. Mr. Biden is expected to say the US will make a 50% cut in emissions by the end of the decade and go to net zero by 2050. That means cutting emissions as much as possible and capturing those that can't be prevented by planting trees or through engineering solutions. The UK says the world is moving on the climate issue.
When we were announced as the COP26 president, less than 30% of the world economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at 70%. So we have seen some progress, but what we need to do is to get more progress in terms of near-term emission reduction targets to 2030.
But as Greta Thunberg says, setting targets is easy, delivering on them is much harder.
Of course, it's a step in the right direction, but if only it was that simple that we could just invest and put money in things and that would solve the problem. Of course, that will be required as well, but it would take so much more than that. We need to be realistic and see the whole picture.
The idea of the meeting today, which is being hosted virtually from Washington, is to get big emitting nations to raise their game on climate. What is needed at Glasgow in November is to get them to commit to policies that really will deliver carbon cuts that can keep climate change within manageable limits. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
Friends and family have gathered for the wake of the 20-year-old black man, Daunte Wright, who was shot dead by police near Minneapolis. His funeral will take place later.
It comes after the US Justice Department announced a federal investigation into the city's police department following the conviction of a white former police officer for the murder of George Floyd. His death sparked national outrage and calls for police reform, as David Willis reports.
In the city where George Floyd took his final breath, they are mourning the death of another unarmed black man killed by local police. In Minneapolis, mourners gathered to pay their respects to Daunte Wright, who died just a few miles from where George Floyd's murder trial was taking place, also at the hands of a white police officer. Body camera footage of the incident just over a week ago shows that as one officer attempted to put Mr. Wright in handcuffs, he broke free, only for a fellow officer to shoot him as the car pulled away. The local police chief said the second officer mistook her taser for a gun.
find the defendant guilty.
The sight of former police officer Derek Chauvin being locked in handcuffs has been hailed as a milestone in the struggle for racial equality in this country. But convicting George Floyd's killer is one thing. Rooting out systemic racism in the police force, another matter entirely. Nonetheless, the US Attorney General is keen to get going, starting with a federal investigation into policing practices in the city of Minneapolis.
The investigation I am announcing today will assess whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of using excessive force, including during protests.
The problem, though, is nationwide, and many believe the challenge for civil rights activists is keeping the conversation going until meaningful change has taken place. David Willis, BBC News, Los Angeles.
Labour is calling for a thorough investigation into the Prime Minister's text messages with the businessman Sir James Dyson, who was asked to make ventilators early in the coronavirus crisis. It wants a committee of MPs to examine the exchanges, claiming Boris Johnson was attempting to selectively target tax breaks for a political friend. Mr Johnson has insisted he was right to move heaven and earth to secure ventilators.
India is being devastated by a second wave of COVID, which the country's Prime Minister has called a coronavirus storm. In the past 24 hours, almost 300,000 new cases were reported, the biggest daily rise in any country, and more than 2,000 people died. Officials said hospitals across India were at breaking point.
The Brit Awards will go ahead with a live audience next month as part of the government's research into how large-scale events can reopen safely in the pandemic.
Now, this ceremony is going to take place in front of 4,000 people inside London's O2 Arena on May the 11th. Can you imagine it?
Just the feeling of being back in a venue.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It's going to be very, very different. Our entertainment correspondent, Colin Patterson, has been looking at how it will work.
Lewis Capaldi at last year's Brit Awards at London's O2 Arena. When the 2021 event happens next month at the same venue, an audience of 4,000 people will be allowed in to watch the likes of Dua Lipa and Arlo Parks perform. 2,500 tickets will be given to frontline key workers from the Greater London area. A ballot for these opens at midday today. The ceremony is the first major indoor music event to become a designated government test event. Those in the crowd will not have to socially distance or wear a mask once in the venue, but will have to provide a negative lateral flow test to be allowed in. They will also be asked to take a test afterwards for research purposes. This will be the first music show at the O2 for more than a year. Colin Patterson, BBC News.
Driving tests in England and Wales will resume today. They, of course, were suspended in late December due to the pandemic.
Yeah, lessons began, though, 10 days ago to give learners a bit of a chance to practice. Our transport correspondent Caroline Davis reports.
Sometimes it takes a few attempts before things line up. But learner drivers have rarely had to wait this long to get a test.
I've had my test cancelled, I think 8 times by this point, but I've kind of lost count. I live quite literally in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest bus station being about a mile or 2 away. It's almost impossible to get around or go anywhere without asking someone else to give me a lift.
The last car driving tests for non-key workers was before Christmas. The delays had an impact on instructors too, many of whom haven't been able to work.
You've still got overheads to cover for the cars. You've got to pay for the cars and the insurances and all that sort of stuff. And also it's been very frustrating for a lot of the pupils that you teach. Effectively, it's 3.5, 4 months since they've last been in the car. And to have that break when you're a fairly inexperienced driver is quite difficult for a lot of them.
But the wait is almost over. There are currently over 400,000 people waiting for a car test in Britain. More examiners are now working weekends, extra people have been recruited, and some have been brought back out of retirement. Even the boss is now taking some of the tests.
Waiting time varies around the country because it depends on how many other people are in the queue and how many examiners we've got in any given location. So it can vary quite a bit. I think the key thing there is that we'll add more test appointments each week as time moves on.
No one knows how long it will take to clear the backlog, so L plates may need to stay on far longer than many would like. Caroline Davis, BBC News.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.